Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. Once again, political brinkmanship is playing out in Washington DC over the United States government's debt ceiling, currently set at $31.4 trillion or thereabouts. There are predictions of global financial chaos if Democrats and Republicans can't agree on a deal to raise or suspend the debt ceiling soon. Democrat President Joe Biden and Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy met at the White House earlier this week to discuss how to defuse the crisis. Probably to the surprise of no one, the meeting ended without a breakthrough. Another meeting is scheduled next week. Even in New Zealand, this matters. The US is the world's biggest economy. It provides the world's reserve currency, and any default on US government debt would shock the financial system where billions of dollars worth of US debt is traded daily. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says if something's not done soon, the US government won't be able to meet its financial obligations as soon as June the 1st. That includes salaries for government employees and the military, pensions, and making interest payments on its debt. Biden says if we default on our debt, the whole world is in trouble. Among the potential solutions touted to the latest chapter in this long-running saga is an unusual-sounding one involving a platinum coin. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Rohan Grey. Rohan is Assistant Professor of Law at Willamette University's College of Law in Oregon. Hi, Rohan. Welcome to the Of Interest podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Look, having read a law journal paper that you wrote, I see that you have a lot of knowledge on the background to this whole debt ceiling issue. So I thought before we get into the coin and other issues, can you explain how and why the US federal government came to have a debt ceiling?
Yes. So normally when the federal budget, process takes place, there are two main sort of steps. The first step is choosing what to spend, how much to spend, what to spend on. But the second step is to choose how to finance that spending. And historically, there have been three main ways that we finance spending, but that the public discourse is really mostly only focused on two. The two most common ways we hear about are, of course, tax revenue, and that includes not just standard taxes, but customs duties, which historically in the United States were far more important in the early republic. It was much more about who could bring things in and out of the country than the people there. And then the second one is borrowing, issuing debt, right? Selling what we call government debt, government securities, treasury bonds, treasury bills, etc., to the bond markets, to the capital markets. But the third way is the simple way of issuing money itself. And when you think about it logically, you actually need the money in existence before you can tax it back out. You need the money to be created before you can then sell debt in exchange for existing money. And so there's always four sort of legs in this process. There's the spending, there's the taxing, there's the debt issuance, and there's some money issuance. For most of US history, the US was on a gold standard, and only since 1930s did it get off the gold standard domestically, and in the 1970s it got off it internationally. So until at least the 1970s, there was a really big difference between issuing money and issuing debt. Because if you issue money, it's supposed to be convertible on demand into gold. And if you run out of gold, you might have a problem. But today, government debt and government money are actually quite similar, almost actually birds of a feather. If you listen to large government banks or investment funds and you talk to them about their cash holdings, they'll actually think you're talking about treasury debt because they hold short-term treasury debt as a money equivalent or as an alternative form of high denomination money. If you're Goldman Sachs, you're not holding quarters or dollar bills, you're holding treasury debt as your cash holdings. So the way the government budget worked historically was every time you wanted to have a new spending bill, you would have to pass sort of two complementary pieces of legislation. One was to say we're going to spend a certain amount, and the other was to specify the way in which the money would be available to spend. Sometimes it would be tax these people or raise an existing tax rate. Sometimes it would be issue a new kind of debt or issue more of an existing kind of debt. And sometimes it would be issue coins, issue paper notes, issue digital bank entries, whatever else it may be, and use what they call signage, which is the difference in the amount of the face value of the money you create and the cost to purchase it as a form of revenue. And so, for example, if it costs you 10 cents to make a $100 bill, then you are making $99.90 in signage revenue. If it cost you $200 to make a $100 bill, it wouldn't work, right? So up until the 1910s, the standard way of doing things in the United States was each spending bill had its own financing authority. It was sort of like having a special credit card or a special bank account for every form of new spending you do. If you want to pay for utilities, you have one account. If you want to pay for something else, you pay for another account. Once we get to World War I, and this really began with the Civil War in the 1860s, but really kind of ramped up in 1917, it became too unwieldy for Congress to micromanage the individual financing authority for each new piece of spending. They were going into a world war. We were in the 20th century. There was heavy machinery. There was a complicated, large federal government. And of course, by the time we get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1930s and then World War II, we had what was, widely considered in the United States to be another transformation of America after the Civil War and the first founding of the Constitutional Republic, which was what they call the modern administrative state. And at that point, you had an extremely complicated federal government. You had multiple agencies all over the place. You had different actors doing different things. The idea of having individual financing authority for each spending bill was too unwieldy. So the debt ceiling emerged kind of counterintuitively, not as a cap, not as a constraint on how much you can spend and how much you can issue or debt you can issue, but the opposite. It was designed to make it easier. It was designed to take 100 different individual spending authorities and consolidate them under one big limit. It's sort of like taking 25 credit cards and rolling them up into one, or taking 15 different bank accounts and rolling them up into one. The idea was to say to the Treasury and the President, which in the United States is the executive branch distinct from the legislature because they don't have a parliamentary system like you do in New Zealand or we do in Australia. And you would say to the Treasury, we're going to tell you how much to spend and on what to spend, but we're going to leave it up to you to work out how to finance it. We're going to give you a range of options. We're going to give you a range of debt instruments. We're going to give you a range of other sources of revenue, and you work out the right mix. You can't spend more than we tell you to spend. You can't spend on things we didn't tell you to spend. In fact, you can't even spend less than we tell you to spend. It's sort of like Goldilocks. You just got to hit it just right. But at the same time, we are going to give you more and more discretion over how you choose to finance it. So that was what the debt ceiling was originally. It was an attempt to give greater flexibility on the question of how, while tightening the reins on the question of what and for what purpose.
Okay. Janet Yellen recently said the debt ceiling's been raised 78 times since 1960 and always with bipartisan support. I mean, I can well remember the 2011 standoff when talks went down to the wire when Obama was president. Was that when the debt ceiling became a political football, or has it always been one?
Yeah, it's almost always been one. The modern debt ceiling, and as I said, it really began around 1917, but it came into its modern form really in 1939. But the modern, pretty much almost immediately after World War II was over, it started becoming politicized. And I think it was about 1953, Senator Robert Byrd, who was a Democrat, actually threatened to shut down the government because he was concerned about certain spending bills. And the Treasury Secretary is forced to use a special gimmick, right, an accounting trick, where they simply changed the value of the gold that they were holding at Fort Knox. They said it was worth a certain amount, and then they doubled the value that they valued it at. And they said, look, we've got more money now, we can spend more. And that was in the early 1950s. And so there were moments when there was a sort of political fight, but it never really got as bad until 2011. But there was a sort of slow ticking up. And there was another moment when the modern debt ceiling got formally codified into law in the early 1980s. And that was also another kind of moment where it became more of a political football, to the point where in 1985, the Treasury Secretary used for the first time an official term that has now become a standard term called extraordinary measures. And the idea of extraordinary measures is you basically pull every dollar that you have in every other account that's available and you suck it all up into the main account to buy yourself a little more time. It's sort of like scrounging around your car for spare quarters and going to your bookcase and finding a few $20 notes that you hid in a book 10 years ago that you forgot about. You're really scraping the bottom of the barrel, maybe an old credit card that still has a limit on it that you forgot about. And they did that in the 1980s, and they've had to use it pretty consistently since then. Another major turning point was in 1996, famously when Bill Clinton was president, and the Republicans took back the House with Newt Gingrich. It was sort of the start of the modern Republican Party, the sort of extremist, hardball Republican Party, this contract with America kind of under Newt Gingrich. And after that, we saw a rise of, again, kind of debt ceiling hardball. But it really wasn't until President Obama in 2011, and I think that was in part because of who President Obama was, the first black president, this sort of fear that the Republicans were going to lose access to the White House for a generation unless they did something different. But most importantly, the global financial crisis and the scale of the response. They were worried that it would cement the Democrats in power for a generation like it did with FDR after the Great Depression. So they were very committed to ensuring that President Obama's term was not successful. And that was the moment where they really went to the wire with hardball over the debt limit. And we saw sequestration, which means certain spending didn't go out that was supposed to for government employees. We saw President Obama essentially blink and agree to compromises, what they called the grand bargain for deficit reduction. And that showed the Republicans that they could extract serious political concessions just to keep the government working, just to sort of keep things going. And since then, they've only ramped that up with the rise of the kind of far-right Trumpist Republicans.
And obviously, President Biden was the vice president at that time. So, he would have been well aware of what was going on. And here we are again. So, look, what is this idea of minting a platinum coin, and where does it come from, and what would it be valued at?
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is, as I said before, the debt ceiling was really intended to give more flexibility to the Treasury Secretary in how to finance. But the other thing to understand about the debt ceiling is it's not a limit on spending. It's a limit on issuing a certain set of instruments, a certain category of instruments that can finance spending. So a great way to think about this would be if you had all the notes that you have in New Zealand, $5 note, $10 note, $20 note, $50, $100 note, and I put a cap on the amount of $10 notes and $20 notes you could issue. Would that mean the government wasn't able to make money? Of course not. You would just issue the $50 notes or the $100 notes, right? Or another example would be if you used to go to work and you're used to going down a certain road to the highway or whatever else, and there's a traffic jam or there's an accident or there's construction, does that mean you get to call out of work sick? No, you have to find another route to get to work. And so what we're talking about here is a limit placed on a certain class of instruments that count as public debt. And not all kinds of debt count as public debt. Some don't. Some, if they have no face value, they only pay interest, they don't count. If they are issued by certain agencies that are sort of outside the official realm of the government that is operating under the federal budget, they're sort of self-funding agencies, they don't count. But historically speaking, money never counted towards the debt ceiling. If you issue a $100 bill, those greenbacks you see in movies, if you issue coins, none of that counts under the debt ceiling. So what the platinum coin idea is essentially saying if we reach a moment where the Republicans are not going to raise the debt ceiling, but the president still has legal and constitutional responsibilities to keep spending, because the single greatest thing that the president could do wrong would be to not spend what Congress told them to spend. First of all, that would mean a default, which would be destabilizing for financial markets. It would mean government employees, contractors, retirees, pension benefits, etc., wouldn't go out, which would hurt average people. And it would implicate a separation of powers, because Congress controls the power of the purse, and it's the president's job to effectuate the spending that Congress has told them to do. So it would be essentially like the president unilaterally saying, no, I think I won't spend what I've been told to spend because I don't want to. So the question is there any possible legal way to use other financing tools available to the president to keep spending going? And interestingly enough, there is a very obscure provision of the Coinage Act that was passed in 1997 that was passed by a very visionary mint director who really expanded the role of the mint, created a whole bunch of new programs, made it essentially a self-funding agency like the Federal Reserve. It has the same degree of monetary and budgetary autonomy as the central bank. Passed a law that at the time was designed to raise revenue for the government, although obviously not this much revenue, that said that the Treasury Secretary, through the mint, can mint and issue Proof platinum coins, proof just means very shiny. If you've ever got a coin out of the vending machine and it's really, really shiny, this is what proof means. It's a sort of polish. Proof platinum coins of whatever denomination the Treasury Secretary determines to be appropriate. And so a lawyer who was just sort of commenting on blogs during the 2011 debt crisis, I was actually following those blogs at the time, named Carlos Mucha, came up with this idea, and he said, look, the Treasury Secretary could just mint a very, very high denomination coin. Right? Most other coin provisions, most other coin laws let you mint as many coins as you want, but they specify the amount, the face value of the coin. If you imagine trying to fund the whole US government with quarters, it's logistically not realistic, right? But the platinum coin provision was unique. It was intentionally unique at the time that it gave the Treasury Secretary complete discretion on how big to put the face value of the coin. And he said, look, just make $1 trillion coin, deposit it at the Fed, in the Treasury's account, just like you and I would deposit a $100 bill at the bank. The Fed gets an asset worth $1 trillion. It's legal tender coin. It's worth just as much as a $100 bill, legally. It's just as valid. And then that money will be available to the Treasury Secretary to spend. So what it does is it allows the President and the Treasury Secretary to honor the law, honor the debt ceiling law. It doesn't require ignoring it. It doesn't require violating it. And honor its spending commitments. That seeming contradiction, that idea that you can't tax or borrow more, but you have to keep spending, that sounds like it's putting the president in this terrible legal, constitutional, political bind, goes away. Now, of course, it sounds ridiculous. It kind of almost shocks the conscience, but it is legal. The plain language of the law says the Treasury Secretary can issue whatever denomination they want, and it has the added benefit of avoiding an economic collapse and a constitutional crisis.
Is there any particular reason why it's platinum?
At the time, it was designed to expand the US Mint's activities in the platinum markets internationally. It was just they have other programs that already existed, but they hadn't enacted a platinum law. And this Mint director, who was quite visionary, said, I think that's an opening. But of course, it's not about the platinum. It doesn't have to be a huge, big coin the size of a semi-trailer or something. It's simply a nominal amount, right? You wouldn't even need the coin if we had other laws saying we could just sort of mark up the bank account the way that the Federal Reserve does. The other thing that's worth noting, of course, is this isn't inflationary. Right? A lot of people will think, wow, aren't you printing money? Isn't this automatically inflationary? The truth is that the amount of inflation is determined by the amount that you spend. If you spend by quote unquote printing money or quote unquote printing debt, right, issuing debt, it's the same. And the counterexample, to just make this point very clear, is if I made a quadrillion-dollar coin and I gave it to my grandmother and she put it under her mattress, it would have no effect on the economy. If I spent billions of dollars into the milk market for children in their lunch, milk, and I did so by issuing debt, it would still raise the price of milk eventually. So it's not about whether there's more or less quote unquote money. It's about what is being spent on and the prices that are being bid up in the economy. And in this situation, the $1 trillion coin is not changing how much it should be spent. That was already determined by the budget. It's simply ensuring that what Congress has already said should be spent will be spent.
Am I right in that some of the suggestions are that it could be used to pay down existing government debt, thereby that's one way of increasing, I guess, the money available to the US government, because if they paid, is that right?
Yeah, the best way to think about this is when you and I pay down debt, we're taking something we have and we're using it to pay something we owe. When the US government issues debt, the rest of us hold that as money, as an asset. The government's negative is our positive, right? If we have a savings account, if we have a pension account, all those kinds of things, we are holding as an investment asset government securities. So if you are swapping government securities for cash, if you are taking away the debt and giving the money, what you are doing is taking an asset somebody has and replacing it with a different asset. Right? The best way to think of this is if you have a savings account that earns interest, but you can't spend it, you have to keep your money there for 12 months, and somebody says, don't worry, we're going to replace it with cash today. It earns 0 interest, but you can spend it tomorrow. Most people don't actually want that. Most people actually put their money in a savings account precisely because they didn't need to spend it and they wanted to earn the interest. So government debt is not a negative, as we're often sort of taught to think of it, like your household debt. It's actually the equivalent of a savings account. So what you would be doing if you used the coin to pay down the debt would simply be shifting a lot of money in the private sector from people's savings account, from their investment portfolios, into their cash account, into their deposit, into their bank account. What a lot of them would probably do is go right back out again and invest it again in something else because they wanted that to be an investment. So yes, you could pay down the debt, and unless you provided another investment asset, which you could do, you could have the central bank itself, the Federal Reserve, could issue a security or issue an account that earns interest. But that one might not count towards the debt ceiling. So what you would do would be purely optical, but of course optics matter a lot in American politics, would be that national debt clock on the side of Fox News would go away. There'd be a different kind of instrument that wouldn't count towards the national debt. Everything else would be functionally the same. People would be holding the same kind of investment assets. They'd be earning the same amount of interest. There'd be the same amount of purchasing power in the economy. The only difference would be all of these highly politicized narratives about the United States borrowing from China and borrowing from our grandchildren would go away. And as we saw over the last 10 years, whenever the Federal Reserve buys up government debt and replaces it with reserves, with digital dollars, it doesn't have any effect on spending. It doesn't have any effect on investment, or at least a very, very marginal effect. So you could do it, but you probably wouldn't even need to.
Something I'm really interested in here is that obviously the generally accepted belief is that the president faces a constitutional trilemma whereby he has to either unilaterally violate the debt ceiling, raise taxes, or default on spending obligations. And they would all violate laws passed by Congress, so they represent unconstitutional options. I mean, you're saying that minting this platinum coin, potentially as big as you want to, really, would be constitutional. Would it, though, align with the intent of the law enabling it?
So there's a number of layers of statutory interpretation. And the first one in the United States, that even most progressive judges, certainly all the conservative judges claim to care about this, but most progressive judges too, is the plain meaning, the clear plain meaning of the law. When Congress passes a clear, plain meaning law that's just very obvious about its intent, very obvious about what it says, you don't look into the intent. You don't pour into the tea leaves. You don't go deep into the history. And in this situation, there was no ambiguity. It says whatever denomination the Treasury Secretary was. The second layer is, if we look at the intent here, the intent was to raise revenue for the government so that it didn't need to issue as much taxes or debt. It was actually a Republican that passed this law because they thought issuing these coins to investors, to platinum collectors, to whoever else would raise money for the mint, and that money would go to the Treasury, which would mean they would have to, quote unquote, issue less debt, borrow less, or raise less taxes. So in a general sense, the intent is similar. Even this is obviously ramping up the amount to a very large degree. But the other thing is, and a much more important level of constitutional doctrine, is that wherever possible, you try to find constitutional options before unconstitutional options. You try to read statutes as not being in tension with each other. So if you have an option that says you have to spend a certain amount, you can't tax more, you can't borrow more, you can't issue more debt, but you can issue as many coins as you want, that resolves a seemingly very important contradiction. And it is absolutely going beyond what the original vision of the people who passed the law was. But a lot of laws change over time. The intent of this law was to give discretion to the Treasury Secretary. The Treasury Secretary is using that discretion. Just because this particular use of that discretion wasn't intended at the time or wasn't foreseen, doesn't mean the intent wasn't to give discretion. Right? If I say, hey, I'm going to give you this break glass in case of emergency, and then 200 years from now, some weird form of spaghetti alien invades, just because I couldn't have imagined that particular scenario, it doesn't mean that that break glass in case of emergency law wasn't there for exactly that kind of emergency. So what we are talking about right now is really a choice between reading this law, which on its face is very unequivocal, to avoid a constitutional crisis and resolve this tension, or saying, I choose to ignore that law and I'm going to violate other laws and cause a huge catastrophic default. Which one of these sounds more disruptive? Which one of these sounds more problematic? The other big part of it is just to sort of get beyond the legalistic analysis. Like, I'm a law professor, I know that stuff is important, but at the end of the day, it's about politics. The Democratic Party is terrified of not looking serious, not looking professional. But they also really want to win on the politics. And so they are blaming the Republicans for causing this crisis, saying, can you believe these guys? Can you believe how crazy they are? Can you believe they're going down the highway at 100 miles an hour and they're not swerving off the highway? Meanwhile, the Democrats themselves are not swerving off the highway either. They're saying, well, it's their problem. They should turn off. At a certain point, the Democrats are prioritizing sounding serious over avoiding this crisis. And if there's one thing that the president and the Treasury Secretary are not allowed to do, it's default. There is no constitutional authority to default. The 14th Amendment says you cannot do it. The existing laws say you cannot do it. Congress did not give them an option to default. They gave them multiple pathways to finance spending, and they told them they had to spend. So at the end of the day, even if Biden really hates it, even if it really makes him feel stupid and silly, the coin isn't a choice. It is the last option before an unthinkable, prohibited option.
You mentioned the 14th Amendment there. Now, there's another option there, isn't there, that I've heard about, where the validity of the public debt authorised by law shall not be questioned. There's a line in there that says that, or something to that effect. I did note Biden was asked the other day about both this 14th Amendment option and the coin, and he said some staff had looked into the 14th Amendment option. What exactly is that, and how would that work? And is it a worse option or better option than the coin?
Yeah, he also said they hadn't looked into the coin, which I know for a fact is not true, which goes to my earlier point, which is they don't want to be seen as validating these silly options, and they don't want to be seen as validating the idea that there is a way off this ramp. They want the Republicans to concede on the politics without having to go to these extraordinary measures. So even today, Secretary Yellen said she thought the 14th Amendment was not a good option, even the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, and the goal of the 14th Amendment was essentially the Union was terrified that the Confederacy would take back control of Congress and refuse to pay the pensions of the Union soldiers. Right? The people who just won the war against the Confederacy, they didn't want them to come into Congress later and pass a law saying, you know, those pensions we said we'd pay you, we're not going to pay anymore. So the point of the 14th Amendment was to actually bind not only the president, but to bind future Congresses from invalidating previously incurred spending commitments. And it says public debt, but it doesn't just mean government bonds. It means any spending commitment. That includes pensions, that includes employee salaries, etc. It isn't a worse option than the coin, but it is a later option than the coin. And what I mean by that is, for the 14th Amendment to be invoked and to be applied here, there has to be no other options. There has to be a genuine trilemma, as you mentioned earlier. If there really is no way to continue to spend without violating some law, then the 14th Amendment says you definitely have to violate some law to keep spending. But if there is a legal option available, even a plausibly legal option, even a colorably legal option, even the kind of stretching the law to the furthest you can stretch it before it snaps kind of option, you are required to choose that option first, because the 14th Amendment is saying you cannot question the public debt, but it doesn't allow you to just ignore laws you don't like or to immediately jump to violating laws when there are legal alternatives available to you. And it's a very worrying trend if you think about the long-term implications. You know, President Trump is about to run for re-election again. He could very well win, which is a scary thought for most people, I think. But the idea that he could just ignore laws that he doesn't like and says, well, I got no other option. And people say, what about those options? He says, I don't want to count those ones, right? The idea that the Democratic Party has put a green light to that kind of politics takes away any moral high ground they have for challenging other much worse despots for just ignoring laws at their pleasure. So the 14th Amendment can and should be invoked, but primarily as a shield to say the reason we have to mint the coin is because we can't ever let a default happen. The coin is far better than ignoring other laws because we can at least make a case that we are following the law here. That is how I think we should think about it. Is the 14th Amendment is a flaw. It's a way of saying the one thing you cannot do here is default. But if there's a choice between ignoring the debt ceiling, saying, hey, I can't continue to spend without issuing more debt, or it turns out I can continue to spend without issuing more debt, I can have my cake and eat it too, I just have to look a little silly. I think that's the much bigger option. And of course, silliness here has to be understood in the context of a debate that most people don't understand. What is government debt? What are the securities markets? What are primary dealers? What is deficit, the budget process? It's this kind of stuff that makes most people's eyes go cross-eyed. I'm an expert and I fall asleep half the time trying to read this stuff. And so what a coin represents, in my opinion, is the bringing back of the budget to a level that the public can understand. No complicated bond markets, no complicated debt instruments. It's something that you can talk to your 7-year-old about. And to me, it's only silly for people who think sounding very serious is being very serious.
It's a fascinating discussion. A couple of sort of questions, I guess, to wrap up is one, do you actually think that the coin will get minted, either in this particular crisis or maybe down the line in the future? And also, if it was, I think it's really interesting because it's sort of a form of direct monetary financing, I guess, where the central bank issues money directly to the government to fund its programs. And how would that be sold to the public? I guess I'm thinking here, if I'm a US taxpayer and I don't really understand how the monetary system works, and I see that the government can just issue this coin like this and create all this money out of thin air, am I going to be thinking, well, why should I be paying tax?
Yeah, on your first question, there's that classic line that that America loves to do the right thing after it's exhausted every other option. We'll see what happens here. I think, unfortunately, what's probably more likely is that Biden is going to come to the table and agree to some form of spending cuts as a budget deal. And that's exactly what he, to his credit, has avoided for the past 6 months. He said, I won't negotiate with these debt terrorists. Well, because when they say they want budget cuts, what they mean is they want cuts to Social Security, to Medicare, to Black communities, to poor people and the programs that help them. They don't mean we want to raise taxes on the rich. They don't mean we want to reduce tax cuts for businesses. They don't mean we want to, eliminate fracking or anything like that, subsidies. They mean we want to stop helping the most vulnerable, and we are going to use this as leverage. And up until now, Biden has commendably not validated that, in part because he was there during the Obama administration, and it was a terrible loss for the Democrats to play that game. They didn't win. The world was worse for them validating that form of negotiation. But as I said, it's sort of sad, but it sounds like at this point Biden is more interested in those kinds of negotiations than he is in playing hardball, even against far-right extremists in Congress, mostly led by the kinds of people supporting the insurrection in January 6th, the kinds of people that the 14th Amendment was explicitly designed to prevent from taking over the government, far-right white nationalists. So I don't know. I think one of the challenges is this is a PR issue, right? This is an education issue. This is a question about how the media, how the public, even how the politicians talk about it. If the Biden administration had come out in favor of the coin 6 months ago and conducted a public education campaign, we'd probably be in a very different position about it right now. The other thing they could always do is they could just pass it on a rainy Friday, right? They do it in a press release, the way that they do when they want to get rid of your civil liberties or pass some new surveillance law or, triple the budget going to drone strikes in the Middle East. There's all sorts of ways to pass laws when they don't want to make a big stink about it. And there's all sorts of ways to frame this, saying, hey, we avoided a crisis. We didn't let these people tell us what to do. And if you want to learn about the details, here's a wall of dense text. And if you don't, just trust us. And most people will probably trust us. And when it's clear that the economy doesn't break, they'll move on. So the public, what's the public going to think about this? First of all, the point of taxes isn't to raise revenue. The point of taxes is to take money out of the economy, right? The reason we tax the rich is because they're too rich. The reason that we take money out every year is so that we can put more money in elsewhere and keep roughly the level of money in the economy, the spending, near a certain amount. So there are important macroeconomic reasons why we tax. Another reason to tax is so that people actually keep using the dollar. They need to actually earn money to pay taxes and fees and things. Another reason is so that you can change the relative distribution of wealth. You take away some from some people and give it to other people. But it is a tricky challenge because for a lot of progressives especially, the idea that we need the tax dollars of the rich to pay for public programs is a very good, convenient political narrative. But it's actually a long-term loser. The reason it's a long-term loser is because it turns the rich into the goose that lay the golden egg. If you can't get taxes from the rich for whatever reason, you can't get healthcare programs and education programs, even though there's an infinity sign next to the amount of money the government has. That doesn't mean you can spend an infinite amount, but it does mean that you don't need to wait outside the gates of the wealthy in order to get the money you need to spend. To your other point about this coming directly from the central bank, the interesting thing is this is not from the central bank. This is from the Treasury. The Mint is part of the Treasury. The Mint has always been part of the Treasury. Even when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the Mint had been around for 120 years at that point. And the money power, the power to create money, has always been shared by the central bank and the Treasury. So you would be minting a coin that would be legal tender, and you would be depositing it. The only reason you even need to deposit at the Fed is so you can then use their banking system, because it's easier to send out digital payments than it is to send out thousands of coins to people in an envelope. But the short answer is, I think it would require people to reassess the relationship between the Treasury and the central bank. The good news is that's been going on since 2008. There is a serious reformulation of macroeconomic theory and policy since 2008, since we had to do quantitative easing, since the central banks had to buy up bonds. Right now, the Bank of Japan is buying up more bonds every month than the Treasury in Japan is issuing, right? It is essentially, quote unquote, printing money to finance the government's deficit. It's just doing it through a convoluted back-end way where it goes through the bond markets for about 5 minutes. But if you look at the Japanese bond markets, there aren't any bonds trading, because everybody knows that what you do is you buy them from the Treasury and you instantly sell them to the Bank of Japan. Even in Australia, they just conducted a thorough review, and unfortunately I think their recommendations were pretty poor at the end, or at least pretty mild, didn't really tackle the hard questions. But they did a kind of review of the Reserve Bank of Australia's operating framework precisely because the traditional balance between fiscal policy and monetary policy is not working as it's sort of thought to work. So I think it is a moment to have a kind of public education moment. This coin would not only get us out of this impasse, but it would allow us to reassess where the line should be. And there should be a line between what the central bank does and the Treasury. But for example, the central bank relies on Treasury securities to conduct monetary policy. It buys and sells government bonds as its primary lever. That's its main intervention into the economy. But what that means is the central bank relies on the Treasury for its operating activities. It calls up somebody else and says, can you deliver all these things to my house so I can use them? That's not independence. So if you had a system where every time the Treasury needed to spend, it just spent the money, and then the central bank was the one issuing bonds if the bond markets wanted bonds, that would be a division of labor that would also work. And of course, remembering the limit on spending, the limit on how much Congress can spend is not whether the money exists. The limit on whether Congress can spend is whether the budget gets passed. So there would be still a very robust debate over the budget. Trust me, the Republicans are not going to suddenly greenlight every form of spending under the sun. They greenlight military spending when they want to. They greenlight tax cuts when they want to. But there would still be a very robust debate about how much that should be spent and on what. It's just that it would be taken out of the realm of how are you going to pay for it? Where's the money going to come from? And it will focus on much more realistic questions like, what's the effect of this going to be? Who's going to win and lose? Is this the best way to use the resources that we have in the world? Real resources, our labor, our land, our knowledge. Or is there other places we should be deploying that for different purposes? So I think it would be disruptive, but in a positive way.
That's really fascinating, Rohan. Thanks a lot for that. That's Rohan Grey, Assistant Professor of Law at Willamette University's College of Law in Oregon. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.